Hey guys, welcome back. I've realized that I continue to reference this, and I found an interesting blog that I'd like to reference here too. They don't actually talk a whole lot about third culture kids, but the title is The Missing Piece for Many Third Culture Kids. And I believe this was the missing piece for me because I spent years dealing with the third culture kid experience and adjusting and understanding that. And I thought that I had broken open Pandora's box when I found out about the third culture kid thing. I was like, thank you. Yes, now I have the answer. But years and years down the road, it turned out that that still wasn't the complete picture, and I was still really struggling. And so when I discovered complex PTSD, I was like, oh, oh, okay. So this was a huge thing for me. So this particular blog, this is Life Story Therapies, and this is an old post. It's from 2017 now, but at the time it was pretty groundbreaking, I would say. So if you're a third culture kid, this article is pretty dang good. It's basically talking about the fact that there's PTSD, complex PTSD, or cPTSD as we refer to it. It does affect a lot of third culture kids because a lot of third culture kids are missionary kids. A lot of complex PTSD does happen to missionary children. A lot of us are raised in very religious environments, often well-meaning and yet extremely stifling, emotionally repressive, emotionally abusive, verbally abusive, even physically abusive environments, and a lot of sexual misconduct happens at boarding schools, etc. So there's a lot of potential for trauma if you've grown up as a missionary kid. It's not necessarily a guarantee. No, of course not. There are a lot of missionary kids that have grown up without any of this, and I'm so happy for you. But there are a lot of us who did. There's also two different kinds. So when you're dealing with complex PTSD, what it means is that you have been subjected to a detrimental situation for a long period of time. You were also in a position where you did not have any control over exiting that situation. So, for instance, initially complex PTSD was often diagnosed in people that had been in prisoner of war camps, right? So they weren't there by choice, they couldn't exit, and they were also subjected to emotional, verbal, physical torture. It's becoming more and more prevalent that people recognize that children are often being put in terrible positions, but they are incapable of exiting that situation. They have no safe adult to talk to about it. They have no one to help them out of it. And so we're just stuck in this almost self-induced purgatory now too, because at some point the child begins to believe that it's really their fault and that it's also their job to protect their abuser, which is often the parent. And this is much more widely spoken about now. But a few years ago, it wasn't so much. It wasn't so popular, I guess. But anyway, getting back to cPTSD and the third culture kid, because you have the third culture elements, it's often difficult to recognize immediately how much of your issues have potentially to do with trauma instead. So, for instance, there's a quiet version of cPTSD and there's a loud version. The quiet version, as they say here, refers to less obvious trauma such as not being understood or listened to, not being allowed to have feelings or needs. That was me. Not expressing them because your parents or caregivers can't deal with them, not feeling safe or secure, not having anyone to go to for comfort or protection, feeling alone, having to constantly break attachments. Now, see, this is something that third culture kids just deal with. It's also just a third culture kid thing. So you also have the complex PTSD, even if you aren't subjected to it by your caregivers, you are technically, because if they've taken you to a different country and you're dealing with a third culture experience and the struggles that come along with being a third culture kid, of not feeling stable, of not feeling attached to any one place or person, of constantly breaking off attachments because you keep moving, of it's a very real thing. Let me just say, it's a very real thing. And if you've got both, just mash it into a ball and throw it in the corner because it's too much to deal with. But the frequent moves, being sent to boarding school, etc. It's also known as developmental trauma. And that's true. If you've spent any number of your formative years in any of these situations, you've got a lot going on. So just being a third culture kid means you're going to deal with not feeling safe or secure or stable at times, unless your caregivers are really, really on the ball and understand that this lifestyle is going to create these struggles for you. And so they are right there for you in those moments. I was like third generation, third culture kid. My parents are third culture kids, that they had unresolved traumas and third culture issues, and they just passed them on down to us. But they didn't really help us deal with them a whole lot because they didn't know how, because they hadn't dealt with their own, because they didn't recognize their own. It's just the whole thing. Anyway, so cPTSD is fairly common among third culture kids, because even if you didn't deal with any sort of emotional, physical, mental, verbal abuse, you still dealt with emotional trauma from the constant, you know what I mean if you're a third culture kid. So as a therapist, they're saying you have to look for intrusions into day-to-day functioning, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that come from the past. And that's both. That's, once again, that's from third culture, and it's also from trauma. It's both. And sometimes you don't know which one it's coming from. They're memories, but they're very real. They include critical voices in your head, persistent feelings of helplessness, emptiness, aloneness, or not being good enough, hypervigilance, waiting for something bad to happen, feeling that you have to be strong all the time, or that good things are for other people, intense reactions that seem out of proportion. Those are triggers. Anxiety, depression, or strange moods that seem to come from nowhere. I don't know why I'm feeling this way. Exactly. So then they vanish suddenly. Well, they don't ever vanish suddenly for me. Once I'm triggered, I'm stuck. And until I figure out why I'm stuck, I'm just going to live this terrible existence until the end of time. You may be drawn to unavailable people. Check. Or find that you can't always parent your children as you would want to. And this is a big reason why I initially started this work for myself and recognized that it was happening, because I just suddenly plunged into, I had always been pretty good at, I was very high functioning. And then one day it just all went down the tubes and I couldn't get out of bed. I was severely depressed. I felt foggy. I would just stand in front of a window and stare. I would be driving down the road and I would think, you know what would happen if I just went straight? There's a curve coming up, but maybe if I just went straight, it'd just be so much easier. Things like that. That's how easy it is to get to that place, because you just, this is your life now. And it's very common. It's very common among third culture kids, among missionary kids. And it's not always clear to us that it's an actual issue and not just us not being tough enough to handle it. So we've been tough all of our lives, and the one moment that we're not supposed to be tough, we don't recognize it. So are there mental blocks that interfere or complicate treatment and recovery? Yes. Sometimes people are afraid that they'll have to go back into the past. You don't want to look at it. The aim of trauma therapy now is to help people process the experience without being overwhelmed. It isn't about going into the past, but working with and resolving memories. But it can feel like you're literally reliving it, let me tell you. Okay, so psychoeducation is the most helpful, helping clients understand what happened and how to recover. And then it isn't this mysterious problem. There's also the fear of therapists. I come from a religious background, that my significant other mentioned the other day. He said, well, why didn't somebody say, hey, maybe a therapist would be useful? I said, oh, no. I said, we've got a fix for that. There's a fix, that is, therapists are bad and evil. And they're also secular. If they're not religious, they're secular. And if they're secular, then they can't possibly understand what you're going through. And also, they don't have your best interests at heart because it's just their job to paint the parents and everybody else as bad people. I'm not here to paint the parents as bad people, but the fact that all of my adult figures were afraid of being painted bad instead of suggesting something that might help me. Narcissism, anyone? I'm not here to be upset at my parents, and that's not what this is about. But I recognize that a lot of authority figures, I mean, how do you know you're in a cult? How do you know? Let me ask. Tell me, if you know, how did you know you were in a cult, even if nobody calls your religious organization a cult, or your past organization a cult, or your past church a cult, or your family? I'm convinced at times that I lived in a family cult, and I think we all do to some extent. That's an issue for another time. But anyway, a therapy that recognizes disassociated states is key. And I think that is really important because it's essential to work with the body in trauma therapy. That's true because your body has assimilated all of the stresses. There's a reason that when my back and my neck are so stiff that I literally can't move without pain, that I'm clearly dealing with something. And it's not just because I lifted that thing yesterday and I shouldn't have. That never affects me that way. But I blamed it for years on physical exertion. But finally one day I realized that I hadn't done anything physically exerting for like 2 years, like nothing that should have hurt my back like that. And I was just still like this. It's because I've been living all of my life in a state of hypervigilance. And as a new mother, I can tell you the hypervigilance is real because you're feeding the baby, you're sleeping, you're awake, you're constantly awakened by everything, you hear everything, even if nothing happened, you think you heard something, you're just constantly in the state of hypervigilance. As a good friend of mine said, initially you're hypervigilant as a mother because you're trying to keep everyone else from accidentally killing the child, rolling on the child, dropping the child, all of these things. And then at some point they get old enough, and then you're in the business of making sure that the child doesn't accidentally hurt themselves. So the hypervigilance never ends. But for those of us who have grown up with PTSD, and also if you're a third culture kid and you're always waiting for the next move and you're always ready for the next jarring movement, the next adjustment, you never quite settle in here. You're always in a state of hypervigilance, and it affects your body, it affects your mind, it affects relationships, it affects everything. I think it's really important to recognize the role that complex PTSD plays in a third culture kid's life. It is highly, highly imperative that you understand this. If you have had any history of any kind of trauma that you may not even recognize, you'll be like, well, because we always downplay it. Well, I didn't get beat. It wasn't that big of a deal. That doesn't mean that it's not severely affecting your ability to cognitively function in today's world. It's not fun to look at, but you won't be sorry you did. Eventually. You might be sorry initially, but eventually you'll be glad you did. So anyway, thank you, Mary Claire and Rachel Kaysen, for this blog. It's very good read. I would recommend it. 10 out of 10. Thank you for that. And I just wanted to address it because I keep talking about it in my videos, that it's not just being a third culture kid. A lot of it, even if you weren't actually physically, emotionally, verbally abused as a child, you still have trauma work to do as a third culture kid. You just do. And it's a huge part of your existence until you face it. So thanks for hanging out with me, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.
close as I am now, I'm already